So what can we say about Jeremy Corbyn? Remember how the tolerant lefties told you how you were a xenophobe and a racist and all the rest of this nonsense because you want out of the European Union and because you care about your own country? Remember the time they tried to call Nigel Farage a racist and UKIP and all the rest of this? Isn't that rather quite funny? Here's the true face of the tolerant lefties. The same tolerant lefties who now support Jeremy Corbyn. The same Jeremy Corbyn who is a supporter of Hezbollah.
I'm no communist, I'll tell you that right now. I believe a man should own his own house and car and cow. I like this private ownership, I want to be left alone. Let the government run its business and let me run my own. My biggest criticism of Jeremy Corbyn, of course, is this little clip here.
But the very principle of a health service as a right and free at the point of use is surely something that we can all be proud of. And that, my friends, owes its origins to those socialist thinkers in the 19th century that saw the evils of free market capitalism in Victorian Britain. Think about that.
Jeremy Corbyn is a laugh. I mean, anyone who thinks socialism can work, after the historical evidence we've seen plastered around us, is just laughable to say the least. It proves he doesn't even understand the fundamental basics of economics. This is the same Jeremy Corbyn who tried to call Venezuela this some, sort of utopia. He claimed that, of course, that Hugo Chavez had done a great, deal for the poor of Venezuela. I would agree with that. Yes, he did. He actually wiped the floor with the poor. In fact, even dating back as far as 2003, we've seen the food shortages, never let alone all the blackouts. But of course, we'll just forget about that, of course, because, history. History doesn't matter to these lefties. It's laughable because we have the evidence of Argentina that faced 2 defaults in the space of a decade. We have Chile in the early 1970s. We have Venezuela, of course. We have the likes of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union. We have all of these socialist movements. We even have the likes of North Korea, China under Mao Zedong, and let's not forget all the other socialist movements. We can even go as far as talking about Sweden. Now, this is the perfect example, because we can take a look at what, Bernie Sanders is hitting out with. Bernie Sanders. This is the American comedian version of Jeremy Corbyn.
And Senator Bernie Sanders joins us now. Welcome to This Week. You're asking for a lot of shake-up. Is it really possible for someone who calls himself a socialist to be elected president of the United States?
Well, so long as we know what democratic socialism is. And if we know that in countries in Scandinavia, like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, they are very democratic countries. Obviously, the voter turnout is a lot higher than it is in the United States. In those countries, healthcare is a right of all people. In those countries, college education, graduate school is free. In those countries, retirement benefits, childcare are stronger than in the United States of America. And in those countries, by and large, government works for ordinary people in the middle class rather than, as is the case right now in our country, for the billionaire class.
You would think that after seeing what happened in Great Britain between 1945 and 1979, of course, the British Labour Party ended up in bankruptcy by the 1970s, and of course, the blackouts that Britain faced, and of course we had the winter of discontent in 1978 before Margaret Thatcher became the Prime Minister. Oh, but of course we'll forget that fact. And as we know, the winter of discontent was a period where Britain's economy was more or less on the verge of an economic collapse. As I mentioned about Chile, of course, in the early 1970s, in fact in 1970, Communist Allende stepped in and of course nationalised most of their basic industry, fixed the prices of everything, wage controls, all the rest of that, and of course by 1973 Chile hit hyperinflation. Oh, what a surprise. You see, this is a serious question, and this question never gets answered Every time you ask a lefty this question, they dance around it. They do a wee rain dance. They do a wee dance around it because they don't want to answer the question. So the question is, can you name me one communist country in this world where there's been heavy nationalisation? Can you show me an economy with heavy nationalisation where you've ever seen prosperity? Exactly. As we know, lefties like to talk about the wider gap between the rich and poor. They always talk about that, and they always play the sympathy card. The sympathy card of, oh, the poor people, the disabled people, all the, it's always about the poor people they talk about. It's quite laughable, because like I mentioned before about British history between 1945 and 1979, the British Labour Party more or less wiped the floor with the poor. Now this is where it comes down to Jeremy Corbyn and his ludicrous nonsense, his laughable nonsense on the idea that he thinks he can fund an entire economy off the basis of a fiat currency. When we speak about a fiat currency, it's basically paper backed by nothing. It used to be the case you used to have, real value, real monetary value, which came from your gold and silver. Now, the likes of the United States of America, we could look at a graph from 1971 and you can notice a sharp spike. The sharp spike happened after the semi-gold standard was done away with in 1971 thanks to President Nixon. Oh yeah, and don't forget his price controls that of course ended up causing a shortage at the pump. But we'll forget about that. What's most important, however, is to understand about the fiat currency. It is every £1 and $1 to the value of the product. And every £1 and $1 that you print, there is a 1+ debt added to the currency. Now, what that basically means is that the more your currency devalues, the less purchasing power your currency holds. That simply means that, of course, what you could have bought for £10 or $10 50 odd years ago, you could have bought more with your paper currency than you can today. In other words, you were wealthier. This is the best bit. Because this is the same Jeremy Corbyn who thinks he's fighting for the poor. Yeah, fighting for the poor. That's interesting. Because the problem with that is the poor heavily rely upon the paper currency. After all, that's all the poor have. All the poor have is the paper they get in exchange for the work that they do. So in other words, if you're devaluing, if you're debauching the paper currency and they're becoming poorer as the currency is devaluing, but not only that, don't forget the very fact that when you devalue the currency, your cost of living rise, the inflation rises, right? Because your currency is devaluing. You're only able to buy less. The point of the issue is the fact that for the work that these people do and they get the paper in exchange, that's all they have. They're becoming poorer because the purchasing power is driving down. But most importantly is the rich people. The rich people are not affected. Why would the rich people be affected by the devaluation of a paper currency? They would not. They're not affected by it. This is what causes part of the bigger gap between the rich and poor. This is how you know anyone who claims that there was a close between the rich and poor between 1945 and 1979 are talking out their hole. They're talking out their hole because the rich people are not affected by the devaluation of a paper currency. And the reason for why that is because the rich people hold all the capital. They hold all the assets. They hold everything. They're the ones with all the gold and silver. They're the ones with all the, all their assets, their machinery, everything. They hold everything. Their businesses, you name it. They hold everything. They're not going to be affected by a worthless piece of paper that's been devalued. So that's why when you devalue the currency, all you're doing is widening the gap between the rich and poor. The rich is not going to be affected by that, and the poor, who heavily rely upon the paper currency, after all that's all they get in exchange for the work that they do, then of course they become poorer. Now what Jeremy Corbyn's silly idea would end up causing is hyperinflation. What's laughable is how they talk about how evil Margaret Thatcher was. Let me tell you something. See if it wasn't for Margaret Thatcher selling off your oil industry during the 1980s. If it wasn't for Thatcher doing that, you were 100% facing hyperinflation because of what socialism caused, not because of what Thatcher caused. Because of what socialism caused. That's what was basically driving Britain towards hyperinflation, and Thatcher had to combat that. She was in such a mess during the 1980s. There were things she wasn't perfect with, but of course she did the right thing. She had no other option but to sell off the oil industry in order to prevent Britain from hitting hyperinflation. Now hyperinflation is where your economy hits 10% inflation, it then spirals out of control, meaning your costs shoot through the roof. So much so that your average person wouldn't be able to afford bread or milk. In other words, society breaks into riots, and then you have people fighting over food and all the essentials, breaking into shops in desperation for survival. So why does this hyperinflation occur? It's largely because of all the printing of fiat currency out of thin air. Because what happens is when you continue to print that fiat currency and it continues to devalue in its purchasing power, when you devalue the currency so much, the valuation of the currency, people then look to alternatives. Because then they look at the currency and they think to themselves, this currency is no longer worth much. It's no longer worth nothing. You know, so what people do is they seek alternatives. They seek to, you know, it could be, for example, Bitcoin. You don't know what it could be, but at the end of the day, when people start to lose faith in that paper currency, that is when a large quantity of that paper is then left in circulation. Now, if you understand supply and demand, the higher you have of something in supply, this means the lower the demand, meaning the lower the value. So because of that, the inflation skyrockets. What you end up with is what you call hyperinflation. And that hyperinflation occurs all thanks to the stupid Labour Party policy of trying to print fiat currency out of thin air. Surprisingly, one of the Labour Party MPs was, you know, bright enough to actually come out and say that Jeremy Corbyn is crazy for thinking he can fund an economy off the back of a fiat currency. What that tells me is that a number of these politicians in the Labour Party have learned their lesson. Margaret Thatcher has taught them a lesson. Because this is what it all comes down to. Money only comes from two places. It either comes from the private sector, or of course it comes from a fiat currency. Now, what basically funds the entire economy is of course the private sector. Because the government is the one that taxes the people from the private sector, takes the money from the private sector, and that is what goes into funding the public sector. In other words, the public sector does not pay taxation. People who work in the public sector pay what's called a rebate. They do not pay tax money. They don't generate enough to even pay tax. So if you work in the public sector, you work for those who are paying your wages, who are basically working for the private sector. So in other words, It's the private sector that completely funds the public sector. If you didn't have a private sector, you wouldn't have an economy sustainable. That's why a heavy nationalised economy, such as Britain before Margaret Thatcher's era, was heading towards the shit state it was in. Because at the end of the day, it's the private sector that funds the entire economy. As I explained, it's the private sector that funds the entire economy. Therefore, it came of no bloody well surprise why, in 1978, when Britain was on the verge of an economic collapse, why Margaret Thatcher, when she stepped in May 1979, why she began privatisation. Now here is where you have to laugh at people like Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, again, is the American version of Jeremy Corbyn. Basically, someone in cloud cuckoo land. Someone who thinks he can just completely ignore the debt levels and continue on with an endless period of borrowing and spending. Yeah, that's a fantastic idea. And this is another point. These people actually believe that their interest rates are just going to stay low forever. No, that's not going to happen. Your creditors will raise those interest rates, you know, eventually. It will come. And when that day comes, oh by Christ, they will punish them. Now, the creditors are the ones who basically finance the economy. They're the ones who government borrows from. And they're the ones who want their money back. Now, since the creditors are the ones who basically want their money back, they can punish the government in one of two ways. They can punish the government simply by packing their bags and leaving, or of course they can punish the government simply by, of course, raising the interest rates. And of course, that is a likely possibility, especially with someone like Jeremy Corbyn. Now, when we speak about some lunatic, sorry, it's the nicest way I can put it possible, when we speak about a lunatic like Bernie Sanders was harping off about, you know, these Scandinavian countries. And this is where we go on to speak about Sweden. It is important to understand that Sweden between 1870 to 1960, this was their most successful economic time period in their history. You would arguably say mostly between the 1870s to the 1930s. But of course, in that period of time, Sweden did have a relatively very strong free market economy. Sweden, by the 1960s, became what was the fourth richest nation per capita GDP in the world. Surprise, surprise! In the 1960s leading into the 1970s, they began all their big welfare statism, their government intervention, their strong government regulation, their high taxation, and all the rest of it. And all thanks to their government protectionism, failing to let failing industry fail, then of course Sweden ended up stagnating from the 1970s all the way till the economic crisis in 1993. Now, what's most important about that is the fact that you can see the difference, the contrasting difference between the free market period before the 1960s, where Sweden was thriving, and compare that to all the socialist nonsense. Now, the most important fact is that before the big generous welfare state in Sweden, Sweden had high levels of equality. Therefore, where was the purpose, where was the reason for the welfare state in the first place? There was no, reason for it, so to speak. However, continuing on, Sweden, after the economic crisis in 1993, what did Sweden do? Sweden began deregulation, Sweden began privatisation, and this is what we call, okay, it's not a free market, but it does have strong free market principles. And it moved towards what we call a mixed economy, which is a social market economy. That's right, a social market economy. A social market economy is not a social democracy. A social democracy is where you seek to completely eradicate capitalism completely from the economy. In other words, it requires the use of force, therefore all that bullshit about avoiding militancy of communism is all nonsense. However, we won't even go into that. The most important point of the issue is, when we talk about countries such as Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Germany, Luxembourg, all of these countries are what we call social market economies. They are not social democracies, what Bernie Sanders tried to call them. Now, in each of these countries, they all have strong private enterprise. Now, the parts of these countries that are socialist are not benefiting their economy at all, and we can touch upon this by looking at a country such as their utopia called Norway. Norway was more fortunate than Sweden. It hit a jackpot, and that jackpot was, the North Sea oil. Now, the problem is that in economics, resources, as we know, are scarce. And the whole purpose of economics is to find a way that we can better improve our living standards whilst using the fewest resources as possible because resources are scarce. Now, all thanks to the mixed economy, Norway was abusing the North Sea oil ever since the 1960s. And from 1960s right up till, today, Norway had been heavily dependent upon the North Sea oil. This is where Norway got their very high GDP from. It got its high GDP off the back of the energy sector. In other words, it was heavily dependent upon that North Sea oil. They were the fifth largest oil exporter in Western Europe. This is just a simple fact. However, what's most important is people look at that GDP, the high GDP, in black and white. They don't realise that outside of the energy sector, outside of the North Sea oil, Norway has a severe lack of productivity. Therefore, the GDP comes off the back of all the North Sea oil, comes off the back of all the, the energy sector. That's where their high GDP comes from. The high GDP does not come from outside of the energy sector. And how do we know for a fact that there's a lack of productivity outside of the energy sector? We know this because high prices in the market signifies scarcity. That's precisely what high prices in the market signifies. Once you understand pricing, you can understand where scarcity is. So we know that Norway has a severe lack of productivity outside of the energy sector, and the reason why that causes them such grief, the reason why that causes them, unsustainability, is because of the fact that when you look at their economy, when they run out of North Sea oil, where then are they going to turn to for their high productivity, for their high GDP? Well, let's face it, Norway has extremely high tax rates. Yeah, and it has a big welfare state. How is it going to fund the big welfare state with a lack of productivity? And why is there a lack of productivity? Why is it a Norwegian car company only has 5% of their workforce left in Norway? Why is most of their workforce working over in China, as well, of course, in Mexico? The very reason for why that is simple. These countries like Denmark, Norway, Sweden cannot sustain the high tax rates. The high tax rates are not a benefit to their economy. That is precisely what's causing their lack of productivity. It's all well heavily depending upon your natural resources such as North Sea oil, but when the North Sea oil is gone, where then are you going to get the productivity from? The high tax rates are not a benefit. That's what's causing the severe lack of productivity. So in order to increase your productivity, you're going to need to greatly reduce your tax rates. That means, and that will, spell the end of the big welfare state in Norway. And these people can harp off all they want about the $800 billion, oil fund that they have. 800 billion, the NHS alone probably costs more than 200 billion per year. You think with a welfare state the size Norway has, it's going to sustain that in 50 years? I don't even think that's going to last 10 years. So this is the laughable part. Norway is heavily dependent upon, the natural resources. It's going to have to reduce its tax rates if it's going to have to get its productivity going again. So you see, these mixed economies are not the utopias they like to make them out to be. But Bernie Sanders tried to make it out as if socialism had something to do with its great success. And Denmark is no different. Denmark is a country where people are paying more than 80% in tax rates. It's ridiculous. It's basically slavery. Most of their money's being taxed out of them, all for the sake of this utopia. The utopia that won't last forever. The utopia where their debt levels are soaring through the roof. It's really sad. It really, really is sad. And I do feel, sorry for the Danish people. Because they're being made to feel as slaves, basically as what they are. They basically are slaves. I mean, how would you feel working, all those hours just to have most of your money taxed out of you? It's pathetic. It really is pathetic. And, these countries with these big welfare states, they only last for so long. Natural resources only last for so long, and you can turn to Bolivia all you want. Bolivia will most certainly, it will definitely go like Venezuela. It will. Once the natural resources are gone, once they've, bled them dry, then where is Bolivia going to get the money from to fund everything? See, this is what it all comes down to. It's the private sector that funds the economy. This is why, ladies and gentlemen, when you compare the difference between the likes of your southern European countries, such as, for example, you look at Spain, France, Italy, Greece, you compare those countries, yet when you look at the size of their private sectors in comparison to the likes of, Sweden, for example, or Denmark, these countries at least have some credibility in the sense that they do have strong private sectors. So they're better off. That's why Germany has been able to sustain itself. Germany is another country that does heavily depend upon natural resources. It will face its, Judgment Day. It will face its day where it's going to, face a heavy punishment, especially with this current, economic, immigration crisis that they're facing. That wouldn't be so bad if they had a free market, but they don't. Because of their big welfare state and their high tax rates, Germany is going to be facing a lot more problems. So it's important to keep your eye on Germany at the moment, because I don't think it will sustain what they're facing at the moment. Saying that, they are more conservative, at least in comparison to the likes of Jeremy Corbyn, which is saying something. But what's important to look at is the contrasting difference between the northern part of Europe with the likes of Germany, Sweden, Denmark, and you compare all those countries to the likes of your southern European countries. And that's why Greece ended up in the mess it did. You cannot expect to have a tiny small private sector and a big massive public sector and then somehow expect your economy to sustain itself. What planet do these people actually live on? So yes, all the likes of Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, they're a complete joke. I mean, they're that much of a joke that even, you know, a number of politicians in the Labour Party understand this, which is quite something to say the least. At least that's some positivity, you know. But you see, that's the whole point. that's the whole point. The fact that Jeremy Corbyn has a large enough support, maybe not down south, but has a large enough support up in this country, goes to show you how brainwashed people are in Scotland. It's like, and I don't blame the people. I don't blame Scottish people. I don't. I blame the system. I blame the educational system. I blame the government. I blame the mainstream media. That's what I blame. Because they've been led up the garden path. They don't understand why the Labour Party left all that socialist nonsense behind from before 1979. They don't understand why. The reason why they did it is because it's unsustainable. You know, we were literally, no joke, 8 out of 10 of the Communist Manifesto planks were ticked off. We were literally on the road towards communism. How the hell can anyone call that sustainable? And the fact that these people support that are they're either subconscious communists or they are communists. They bloody well know it. It's a laugh. It's a joke. And you know, I'm not a supporter of the current system. I don't support the wrongdoing of what the British government do. You know, in terms of like taking us to all these wars and what Tony Blair did and all the rest of this nonsense. I don't support all the wrongdoing by our British government, right? But there is a serious threat from the likes of ISIS. There is a serious threat that's facing us at this moment in time, and these lefties are hell-bent on destroying our country. It's like, you know, the mind of the common lefty is so far out of touch with the basis of reality that they actually think it's just a case of just sitting down with a cup of tea and having a cup of tea and discussing it with ISIS in some civilised manner, and somehow the likes of these extremists will somehow come along and just agree to it. It's just, they don't live in the real world. They live so far out the basis of human reality. It's like, my God, where do you even get that view from? You know, it's like, there's something seriously, mentally wrong with these people. There seriously has to be. Anyway, folk, I've rattled on long enough. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you've got any questions or anything like that, feel free to ask me in the comment section below, and I'll be sure to get back to you. Talk to you later. Cheers. So yeah, folks, I do have a number of videos coming up. I will be doing videos on the Industrial Revolution, which of course I hope to break that down into various parts. I think there are, you know, various things I do want to touch upon, that I do want to address, because I think that's a very important part in history. So please check out my videos when it comes along on the Industrial Revolution. I'm sure you'll enjoy that. And don't forget, you can also check out my other videos that I had done. I done ones on the capitalism and communism. I'd also done various videos in terms of response to a boy Red Scare TV on Nazi Germany, so you can check those out if you haven't already. But anyway, people, I hope you've enjoyed the video. You can also check out my Twitter and my Facebook. Don't forget, you can also check out my Patreon, where you can support me on there. And I forgot, I don't think there's anything else other than share my video, and of course you can subscribe to my channel. So thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you later. Cheers.